Okay, I think I'll get us started here. So if you could grab your lunch and take a seat. I'm very happy to welcome Morgan Grove back to the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. And I want to say a few words about him. He was a Yale all the way, Yale undergrad, Yale master's, Yale PhD with the incomparable Bill Birch. And got a Presidential Early Career Scientist Award, which was a springboard for him to go to work in the Baltimore long-term ecosystem research site, which was one of those two systems that was funded by NSF to look at ecosystems that are urban. And he has been one of the key members there, principal investigator, and done really exciting research, some of which he talked about in the urban ecology course that he taught here this past fall, which was a huge success, and he's coming back, I think. Works for the USDA Forest Service officially. What's that? Officially. Officially, yeah, okay. Now, a little bit of housekeeping here. This is being filmed, and so everything needs to go into a microphone. So Morgan's going to talk into a microphone, and at the end of the talk, when you want questions, we have two microphones set up here. You will line up, come to the mics, and ask your question. Okay? Everything good? So, great. Morgan.
Thank you. All right, well, what I would like to talk with you today about is maybe 15 or 20 years worth of work on environmental justice and sort of where we're heading. And it's both in terms of research and it is in terms of thinking about solutions. This presentation, this body of work is work that we've done with my co-authors, Billy Hall and Dexter Locke, who are at SSINC, Laura Ogden, who's at Dartmouth College, Stuart Pickett, who's at the Carey Institute, and Chris Boone, who is at Arizona State University. There are going to be two sections to this talk. Ideally, it'll be apparent to you that they're connected. And the first is a science mystery that came to us as we were doing our work in Baltimore, and then to think about it in terms of a societal solution. What can be done? We're not claiming that we have the sole solution, but we have an idea of one direction to go. And in doing so, I'll be showing a video, and I apologize in advance as I fumble through trying to do that aspect of it. So the mystery that we'll get started with is one of polluting industries, disamenities, and tree canopy cover in parks, which are amenities. And the sort of traditional view, and still a good view, but a traditional view of thinking about environmental justice is to think about patterns and to think about patterns of disamenities. And often, or where it started with the environmental justice research in the 1980s, was to take a look at polluting industries and landfills and toxic disposals, and how those were disproportionately found in disadvantaged communities. And that may be because of African American communities, that may be because of income, but this notion of disadvantaged communities and the siting of toxic disamenities. So we tried this out in Baltimore, and what we found when we looked at toxic release inventory data, which is data that's published, or at least it used to be published by the EPA, that showed where did you have polluting industries. And we mapped where all those were. This is work that was started by Chris Boone. He mapped where all those were. And then we put together the census data for the city of Baltimore, and we found that whites were disproportionately around these toxic sites. Didn't make sense, at least not in terms of that traditional environmental justice research. We also took a look at those amenities, and really when we talk about EJ, it was the disamenities. We added in the amenities, and we looked at, well, where do we have the trees and where do we have the parks? Again, relating it to census data. And we had been driving in a direction of trying to come up with and examine different theories about where you would find trees. And we had developed something in Baltimore, which now is used more a lot of other places, called urban tree canopy assessments, that had started in Baltimore. And we had three theories to test out. We had population density as a theory, and so the more people you have, the less trees you would have. Alternatively, social stratification, income, and education, that power explains where you have trees. And then a third theory, which was reference group behavior theory, which is the combination not only of population density, income and education, occupation, but also family status, your life stage or lifestyle would be the predictors of where you would find trees. And when we did this analysis, it turned out that this idea of life stage of reference group behavior theory was actually the best predictor. We said in the paper that it was 1 trillion times better explaining where we had the trees than the other two theories, and the statisticians who reviewed the paper said that that was gratuitous, and so we had to take that out and just say a lot better. But we decomposed those different typologies, and something strange that was coming out in the data, which was that African Americans were positively associated with where we had trees, which again runs counter to the environmental justice literature. So the question was, is Baltimore just a strange place? But we know that answer, it's yes. Or what else was going on? And when Chris Boone also looked at where did we have parks, it turned out that African Americans had better access to parks than the white neighborhoods that were in the city. This is puzzling. And we started to try to figure out what might be the underlying roots for what we were observing. So we have a way to start to think about this, which is we have disamenities and amenities, and we have patterns or distributive justice, and then we have procedural justice. How do things happen? How does it come to be? And so environmental justice has expanded its purview to think about who has access in terms of patterns, in terms of both disamenities and amenities, but also the procedures. How do things come about? Do people have agency? Do they have a voice? Do they have a role in the decisions that lead to the patterns? So you could look at these and try to understand them each individually. As a long-term ecological research project, what started to emerge for us is actually to start to think about how these interact over time. Okay? So the idea that you have a pattern at time A may affect the procedures and the patterns that you observe at time B. So this was how we started to try to think about this and try to now go back to the data and try to understand what was going on. Now, we also had a ton of data. As part of the Baltimore ecosystem study, sure, we collect our data, but one of the ways that we think about things are try to avail ourselves of all the other data that exist out there. They may be in a printed form, and it was our job to kind of get everything into a digital world, but we had lots of data that were out there, and it was newspaper articles, neighborhood minutes. We had neighborhood association minutes going back to 1915. We had lots of stuff. And we had this new way of trying to think about these things, and Stuart Pickett came up with this idea of what he called dynamic heterogeneity. And so you could have a pattern, amenity or disamenity at a time. You could have procedures of disamenities that relate to create new patterns, and it can cascade over time. And so that you understand what our time frame is, we're going from thinking about things about 1900, which is when cities which had been fairly diverse in the United States start to become highly segregated. They had originally been diverse places. And as parties were trying to create power in the late 1800s and early 1900s, they started to advocate for things that led to segregation. And so we're going from that late 1800s to the present. and trying to understand things in terms of both procedural justice and in terms of distributive or patterns of justice, and both amenities and disamenities. So now I'll try to convince you that we have started to solve the mystery. What really, when we go back to things and we try to understand what explains what we're observing, it goes back to this idea of historic segregation. Baltimore was one of the first cities, was the first city that tried to put into law the ability of the city government to segregate the city and decide who could live where. That was being copied by Louisville. It went all the way to the Supreme Court and was found to be unconstitutional. People who believe in segregation are going to find other means by which to do it, even though it was struck down as not something that could be done as a city ordinance. What we saw was that they enacted covenants where people who lived in neighborhoods, remember I mentioned we had those neighborhood association minutes, where they talked about how they would all agree in Baltimore not to sell a house to a black or a Jew and keep those people out. If you buy a house in Baltimore County, it will still say on your deed that you are not allowed to sell it to a Jew. They can't change the deed. It's just unenforceable. So what we started to see, and when it becomes enfranchised in the mid-1930s, is with the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which was a federal entity that after the last major housing crisis, where after the Depression and you saw a collapse in real estate markets, the federal government decided it was going to intervene and try to decide how to make investments to help people get those mortgages, how to help them to access loans to fix up their homes. And they went out and they classified neighborhoods as red, yellow, blue, or green. This is where the term redlining comes from. The designation of neighborhoods that are worthy investment, neighborhoods that were classified as red were the least worthy of investment, they were the most hazardous, green were the most desirable places. This is what the redlining map looks like for Baltimore, and if you were to read the narrative, some of the criteria for why it was not a good investment was because of the high level, in their words, of Negroes living in that neighborhood. The other neighborhoods had suffered the same sort of bias of race or religion was neighborhoods that you had that were of either Italian or Irish descent and Catholic. So you saw this redlining that was occurring in these areas. Now as we start to take a look at how this creates patterns and procedures over time that creates this heterogeneity, one of the first projects that we did was a project by Charlie Lord, who was working with us on this. And what he did was he and a student went and pulled every single zoning variance in the history of Baltimore. So starting, land use zoning became enfranchised in the late 1920s as something that the Supreme Court recognized as an authority under the police powers that cities had. They started to look at zoning and zoning variances, and they took all those zoning variances and they classified them as whether or not they were an environmental zoning variance or not. And what they found was that, and then mapped that to the census data over time as well. We put that together. And what they found was that there was a clear bias that variances were approved in African American neighborhoods over time, and that the zoning variances were disapproved in white neighborhoods from that period from 1930 to 1970 until the zoning boards were reorganized, also when Baltimore became a predominantly black city, and that variance goes away. What they also found was, and they pulled every single court transcript of every single zoning variance. And so they saw the rationale for what was happening. What was the judge saying in terms of approving things? And you had, in one rare case where you had an African-American lawyer representing an African-American neighborhood, the lawyer saying, we know what's going on. You're dumping this stuff where we live. And in fact, you had white businesses that were subscribed to, their clients were white people that were being placed in black neighborhoods. So it wasn't even like, well, they were moving it towards the people who wanted to use that business. they were purposefully dumping this. And the black neighbor lawyer was saying, we know what's going on. And in fact, when they had a black lawyer, the rate of being able to fight it went up. But the ability to resist was not uniform across these black neighborhoods. And the rationale for why these things were being approved in these African American neighborhoods was because, and the judges said this, these places are already bad enough, right? They can't get worse. We're just going to keep pushing this into these neighborhoods that are already in bad shape. But they had already been made in bad shape by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which had not given them access to mortgages and loans. And they said, we're not going to put in the white neighborhoods because we don't want them to get any worse. So you had that as what started the sort of dumping and the continual procedures of putting things in this pre-existing state. Now, that same logic was coming up in other places as well, not only in the zoning variances. We also saw it when it came to the efforts for the city to start to do those parks and to improve those parks. And there was clear documentation that kids in Baltimore in the 1930s, 1940s, African American kids, their street was their park. That's what they had in terms of those quality resources. And they went to the Olmsteads, the Olmsted sons, the adopted son and the birthright son that ran the Olmsted firm, and they said, well, we should spend money to try to improve the parks where these African American communities are. And Olmsted wrote in a letter to the head of the Parks Association for Baltimore City, well, they won't take care of it. Why should we do that? Why don't we put the parks and reserve the parks for people who will actually appreciate and take care of the parks? And so there was money available at that time in the 1940s, and they put it into the creation of what is now Gwynns Falls and Leakin Park, that they secured that large stream valley rather than fixing up and creating parks in those low-income neighborhoods. Same thing goes when it comes to golf courses. What happened in the 1930s was African Americans asking for access and being able to use the golf courses, which at that time were not available to African Americans. The thing about the golfers is that they actually had some money. And so they were able to hire those lawyers, and it turns out the lawyers are, we all may say damn lawyers, but they were able to hire the lawyers to get that representation and to take it to court. At that time, you already had Plessy versus Ferguson, which said separate but equal, and the golfers were able to demonstrate that the golf course that was made available to them was only 9 holes, not 18, and was taken in really terrible shape. And the white establishment that was arguing against the giving access to African Americans to the other golf courses in the city started to use these spatial explanations. They said, well, once you start to let them come play at the golf course, then they're going to want to live around those they want to live in those neighborhoods around those golf courses, that there would be this spillover effect and that there would be this invasion or attempt to invade into these neighborhoods where these golf courses occurred. So the white establishment had the choice of either fixing up the golf course, making it 18 holes and taking good care of it, or providing access to all of the golf courses. So they were sort of provided with this choice about, are we cheap or are we racist? And it turned out they were cheap. And so they opened up the golf courses to the rest of the golf courses throughout the city, and also improved things at Carroll Park in order to give full enfranchisement to the golfers. So we started to see this segregation that existed in the city as creating prior conditions that were part of the procedural rationale for why we had things, and it became the rationale, though it did not succeed, in trying to keep people out of things like the golf courses and the pools and the tennis courts and so on. This plays out still when we get to urban renewal, which is the major effort in the late 1960s and 70s where the federal government is putting money into cities, and the question is, where do we fix neighborhoods up? Again, it's the prior condition argument as a procedure that causes them to focus on planting trees in these neighborhoods and not in those neighborhoods. Now, we have segregation, which was a major driver, which still doesn't explain everything. It explains the disamenity issue that we had in terms of the whites and the TRI sites. And the reason for this is that with segregation, the most desirable thing that people wanted to do was to live close to work. In the 1910s and 1920s, they wanted to live close to those industries, Bethlehem Steel, General Motors, and so on. It turned out that those were polluting industries, but it was segregation that caused those white people to be close to those polluting industries. It's a different rationale, but it's part of the segregationist history when we get to the amenities and what we call inherited landscapes. So we had segregation, and we explained the Homeowners Loan Corporation. The other thing that was going on in the 1940s and 1950s is what we call blockbusting. And for those of you who are not familiar with the term blockbusting was, and it happened in Baltimore, but it happened in Philly, it happened in Chicago, it happened in lots of places, where you would get a white real estate agent after desegregation, after it was deemed that blacks could live wherever they wanted to, supposedly, is that white real estate agents would go and buy a home in a white neighborhood. They get past covenant part, right, because covenants were still kind of being enforced, and they would move an African-American family into that neighborhood. Often they would create as a rental property, move several families into that house and subdivide it. Then the white real estate agent would go to the other remaining white neighbors and say, they're coming. Sell it to me cheap, sell it to me now, move out to the suburbs, move out to the county, and you won't lose your money, or you won't lose much money. And so you had this active role of the real estate agents and the real estate markets playing into the fears of people that their neighborhoods would decline through this blockbusting. So what happens with that is that you have African Americans moving into neighborhoods that had disproportionately received amenities of parks and trees during the prior iteration. They are now moving into these neighborhoods. So when we look at why do we observe that African Americans have greater access to parks and greater access to those trees, it's reflecting that history of that blockbusting that occurred. So we have the legacies of redlining from the 1930s explaining why we see this distribution of disamenities, and then we have these lags. It takes time for trees to die. That explains why are we starting to see African Americans positively associated with amenities such as trees and parks. So the main point here is that to understand the interactions among procedures and patterns, but also at the root cause of this is a systematic history of racism, not just an impact, in trying to understand what we were observing in Baltimore. So it takes us to, and now we're able to sort of populate this idea that we supposedly had locational choices, freedom of locational choices in housing markets, but we have intervening in it residential segregation that affects this distribution of disamenities and ecological structure. And as we start to look forwards, is to wonder what are the governance networks, how might they respond with this kind of knowledge, how will this relate to sustainability, resilience, and how could this start to inform community redevelopment? So in summary of this first section is this idea that we have to challenge the economists who talk about landscapes of choice and everyone can live wherever they want, and that we have to look deeply in the historical context about this lack of choice, this idea of inherited landscapes, and that this deep historical knowledge is important for trying to understand the contemporary conditions that we observe. And really importantly, this idea that segregation is an underlying social ecological driver of environmental differences that really has not been yet fully addressed within the environmental justice literature, and that we have to include these spatial and temporal explanations in order to understand urban ecological systems, right? And that we need to address that to environmental justice, and we need to try to really bring in segregation as a driver of what we observe in urban ecological systems. And here we make the case that dynamic heterogeneity is one way to understand this. What I'm going to try to do is actually make the case to you that dynamic heterogeneity is nice but also insufficient. But before I do that, what I'd like to do is while I picked on Baltimore, and I love Baltimore, as we know, is that this is not unique to Baltimore. So here, Dexter Locke, who is a graduate of this fine institution, he's been working with Billy Hall. What they did is now all of the homeowner loan corporation maps are available online in a map-based form that is amenable to GIS. Dexter and Billy have been working on this the past 2 weeks, and they pulled all those homeowner loan corporation maps. And then they cross-referenced it with the data sets that we have for high-resolution land cover mapping, those UTC data sets. And so he mapped it for every single city that we had the homeowners loan corporation data sets. And then he mushed all those cities together, including New Haven. We got New Haven. And what you see is that the land cover tree distribution for today is explained statistically significantly by the homeowner loan corporation maps of 1935 for all these cities. This is bad, but it's not bad just in Baltimore, right? What this is showing us is that this is a national phenomenon for those cities that had this happen. So I guess my point to you is trying to argue not only for segregation as something for us to study in Baltimore, but that it is more widely relevant than just Baltimore. Now I'd like to shift gears a little bit and try to talk about how do we try to tackle these things. Because knowledge is good, research is good, but we also have to start to figure out ways by which to affect change. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to give you how we're trying to do it. You might find, should you choose, other ways to do it. So to start off with, Baltimore has about 17,000 vacant homes, about 14,000 vacant lots. When you map that so that's data for today. When you map that to the homeowner loan corporation, or HOLC map as we call it, it pretty well is mapping up to those red and yellow neighborhoods. And as a sort of, to connect back to what I was talking about earlier, the redlining is what we're familiar with in terms of the talking about things. The yellow neighborhoods would have been those neighborhoods associated with the blockbusting. That's where you would have had the low-income white neighborhoods at work. When you start to plot out where do we have these vacant homes and vacant buildings, are coinciding with those red-lined and yellow-lined neighborhoods. So some other things to think about. Unemployment rates can be as high as 30% in these neighborhoods. Again, and in Baltimore, they talk about the black butterfly, which is those red and yellow lined neighborhoods. And then the blue L, which is the doing well, affluent, old money at the top of the L, and then the millennials going across. But here you see sort of what's in, it's a mixed metaphor, but that's really kind of Baltimore. It's like, the black butterfly and the blue L, like that doesn't make any sense. It lacks any illiteracy, but that's what we got. But you see that concentration of unemployment rates that we have. And I would argue that poverty and unemployment is one of the major things that have to get solved if we're going to get out of these feedback loops. When we look at where the state of Maryland spends most of its money on corrections, it's almost, a huge amount of the percentage of all of the taxpayer money on corrections is spent for people who are residents of the city of Baltimore. Here it's showing how much is spent each year by neighborhood. And so in some of these neighborhoods, more than $15 million a year is spent on incarcerating people. The cost of incarceration is $38,000 a year to keep someone in jail. To kind of connect to things that you may have read, this is reflecting what's been called the new Jim Crow, which is locking up people, throwing them away. So there's a huge amount of money that's being spent on keeping people in jail. But there's also environmental things. When we map out where do we have trees, for instance, and with trees comes urban heat island, and with urban heat island comes vulnerability to heat waves, and it's a cascading set of things. It starts to map pretty well with this redlining as well. You still have the inherited landscapes, but it's really bifurcated. You have the inherited landscapes, but you also have the effects of the redlining too. So what you start to see in all of this is, rather than previously I'd said we used a lot of data to try to understand what's going on, we would argue that segregation has a lot of parts. It's got the vacancy, it's got the crime, it's got the poverty, it's got the environmental conditions, all of those things conspiring together now to keep these neighborhoods sort of where they are. But it's complicated. What we did, and again, this is something Dexter and Billy, so when I was a student, Birch would come down the hallway and say, Grove, 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 do that thing you do with the computer where you press buttons and you make data. And so I would dutifully do that. And now I find myself, I go down the hallway and I say to Billy and Dexter, do those things that you do and you press buttons and make data. So now I understand better, Bill. What they did was they took the census data from 1930 and they classified every single neighborhood in terms of what they were designated. Were they red line, yellow line, blue line, green line? And they tracked them over time. And then they mapped them to the current city's housing market typology. And what they have on your left-hand side is the Hulk map classifications from 1930, and then the neighborhood classifications for the city for 2018. And what you see is that those red line neighborhoods are all over the place. Like, some of them are still stuck in a really terrible place. Others are some of the most desirable neighborhoods overall. What you see is, in addition to this, is that the block-busted neighborhoods are almost uniformly doing terribly. And each one of those lines is actually us following different neighborhoods over time. This allows us to try to go back and go, okay, what is the fate of each neighborhood? What we see is that redlining is not the same thing as determinism. It is a major driver, but for yellow line neighborhoods, maybe it is. And we need to understand these dynamics over time. We also need to understand that the green line neighborhoods, the really affluent white neighborhoods, are still doing great. Like, they have figured out how to keep their stuff, right? And there's something to learn from that as well. So this data piece has really been is an attempt to change the conversation to not only to move beyond just focusing on red line neighborhoods, and that is deterministic, but to look at each of the classifications and as an opportunity to learn, right, about why are the green line neighborhoods able to do so well and keep it, and why have the yellow line neighborhoods really done terribly in this. We need to spend time doing this, but I suspect a big part of the yellow line neighborhoods is that they became overcrowded rentals and also didn't enjoy that investment. While the red line neighborhoods still were homeowners. They still owned what they had, but that's for another time. What I would like to do now is show you a video. It is produced by Room and Board, which is a home furnishings company. That is about our project in Baltimore as we try to address all this stuff. Okay, so we're going to Let's see if I can do this. Don't panic yet, Colleen. I might figure it out.
There are many vacant and abandoned buildings in the city. There's a lot of value locked up in those buildings. There's an opportunity to take those buildings and to deconstruct them rather than demolish them. We see the possibility to salvage the materials in the building, and then we see what comes next for that land. And we see how we can actually turn those buildings into bright spots in the community.
The U.S. Forest Service contacted us about an interesting project, reusing salvaged urban wood, and the project really has social benefits as well as environmental benefits, and we were very intrigued by the opportunity, so we called them back right away.
What makes an enterprise truly socially impactful, right, is that you have an actual mission or a product, a service that you're providing that has positive change. There are actually about 40,000 houses in the city that are presumed vacant. 17,000 have actually been identified. What we actually do, the service we provide, is having a powerful impact on the city of Baltimore. And it's creating jobs for individuals. But the work itself has got real strong environmental and social impact. If you can do it in a way where you can increase that social impact by virtue of making it an employment vehicle for people who've got some challenges getting back into the workplace, now not only do you have a socially impactful service or product, but you're doing it in a socially impactful way. The yellow pine that we get from these Baltimore row houses is old growth or second growth. It's trees that pretty much don't exist anymore. We basically take old materials and prepare them to be used again. We try to employ people who have what we call barriers to employment, which is sort of a fancy way of saying that they may have had a felony conviction, they may have had a past problem with addiction, they may not have graduated high school. Oftentimes it can be all of the above. So our mission is to hire these people and train them and equip them with skills that they can use here, but that they can also use in another job.
I was unemployed. You know, I was going through some personal things, so I didn't have a job. But then I got into this program that Manning has, where they help people get back on their feet. And they got me a job here. I've been here ever since. Without a doubt, we're with a great group of guys. I mean, we're not just co-workers, we're like family. We help each other here and outside the job, you know, and just make you feel proud. I guess that's the word I'm looking for.
These days we recognize that a lot of people live in urban and urbanizing areas, and their quality of life in those areas is incredibly important, and it's oftentimes dependent upon, in part, the green infrastructure that they have, that is the forest and the trees and the neighborhood parks that they have access to, and that's really critical. That's another element of helping to bring communities back. And so what happens to those lands once the buildings are gone? Well, that's where the Forest Service and many partners come in. In fact, in Baltimore, partners are driving that process. Parks and People Foundation and others are critical in helping communities imagine what could be on those landscapes.
At the end of the day, when you look over it and you see a park, it's just everything is coming together for the good, you know. And it's just a blessing. You see something that looked like it could not come back to life. It made me think about in the Bible, and it says, "Can these dry bones live?" Right? And they came back to life. That's our community. You know, we living, and I'm happy about it.
I get excited about working with people and meeting new people. The people in Baltimore and the Forest Service that we've connected with are some of the most passionate, brilliant people around. The environmental perspective alone is incredible. I've just been surprised and shocked in the best possible way from the very beginning, and I can't wait to do more.
Okay, so not quite done yet. So that's a video that's trying to talk about a lot of complicated and interacting things. When in the urban ecology class that I teach, one of the things that we use is this idea of parsings, and I don't know, maybe the students question whether or not I could do one. So here's mine, and what we have here is a whole bunch of parts. We have the relationships among the parts. We're trying to identify where do we have leverage points and where do we have feedbacks. And often what we're observing in these areas is these positive feedbacks. And when I say positive, I don't necessarily mean good. What I mean positive is self-reinforcing, and it keeps it driving in a certain direction. And the positive feedbacks that we have in these red-lined and yellow-lined neighborhoods are bad. The positive feedbacks that we have in the green-line neighborhoods is for their good. We put this together. I cheated. I had help. We put this together with Quantified Ventures and Ben Cohen, who's also a graduate of ours, and we did the economic analysis of this. And we did this for meeting with the Secretaries of Housing and Community Development, Department of Labor and Labor Relations, and with the Department of Public Safety and Corrections for the state of Maryland. And what we were able to show between the city and the state is that for an investment of about $18 million, that there would be real transacted dollars of $455 million. And Secretary Holt, bless him, put up $15 million to continue this project. Now, that can't be enough. We have to figure out ways by which to create additional value, and that's why with Brick and Board and with Room and Board, they are coming in and they're using the materials in order to, and they have a financial motive, but they also have a social responsibility motive, and you have Room and Board actually going out and searching firms, companies that can produce their furniture in Baltimore, right, to become part of this. So in addition to shipping this material out to Pennsylvania and West Virginia and, God bless them, Vermont, that we're also making it in Baltimore as well and trying to create positive feedback loops to help escape the situations that we have. What we know is that, so in the city of Baltimore, the recidivism rate is 48%. So jail's pretty much a revolving door. If we keep someone employed for a year, recidivism rate goes down to 1%. Keep them employed for 2 years, recidivism rate goes to 0. The recidivism rate for Humanum and these guys who are working on this project, the recidivism rate is 0. So every single one of those persons is also $38,000 of avoided costs. All that material not going into landfills is avoided costs. So we need to figure out, and I guess this kind of one of my points and pleas, is that we start to think about ecology of segregation, to think about segregation, to think about environmental justice as systematic things, and that they require systematic solutions. So I think that in our growth of the work that we've been doing as it relates to environmental justice, we started out with impacts. And in fact, some of the impacts that we were observing didn't make any sense. And we had to appeal to and develop an approach of dynamic heterogeneity. But that dynamic heterogeneity really doesn't get us, it helps us to understand but not to solve. And I think that we have to move to the complex systems view with the parsings to start to solve these things. And to really understand segregation, it is a complex thing and it is a resilient thing. And we have to solve it as such. And if we want to solve complex problems, we have to solve them with complex solutions. And that requires that spatial and temporal thinking, as well as that organizational thinking about all the parts that come together. So we need to think about the parts, the relationships among the parts, the leverage points and the feedbacks, and that has ecological consequences. This is not just a social thing. The ecology is part of the amenities and disamenities, but I would argue that if you don't care about people at all, and that's okay, I would argue that this probably has impacts upon the evolution of species in these cities. It has impacts upon water quality. It has impacts upon a lot of ecological things that you may care about. And so if you don't care about the people, it's okay. I'm arguing for the point that segregation has significant ecological consequences on its own. And if one wants to think about sustainability and resilience as good things, which ideally they are, it's hard to imagine being able to achieve sustainability, achieve a resilient urban ecological system if you have these social ecological traps persistent within it. We can't just be sustainable and resilient for some groups of people. We have to be resilient for all, and we may create vulnerabilities for everyone if some people are really vulnerable. One of the things that Stuart Pick and I have written about is this idea of an urban land ethic. And we start with the idea that a land ethic that does not include cities is not an urban land ethic at all. But what would an urban land ethic be? Alda Leopold, also a graduate of this school, argued about and made the case for a land ethic about the relationship of people to the land. I think that when we move to an urban land ethic, it is a relationship of people to the land, but also of people to each other. And here, an ecology of segregation. Segregation is something that is key of those relationships of people to people. I made the case when I showed the homeowner loan corporation maps for the number of cities that this is potentially a national thing, given the history of imperialism and colonialism throughout the world, that use the same kinds of devices. At least in those cases, this may be of international scope as well. And with that, I will stop and be happy to take any questions. And I guess, Gabe, they have to come up to that microphone in order to be registered. Thank you very much. Or did I use up all my time, Colleen? Okay. All right. Yes. Yeah, he says you have to come up to the microphone. If you want to listen to him, you have to.
Jillian, can you hear me?
I can hear you. I think it's for the purposes of the Woman with Law. Okay.
I'm just wondering if this model has been shared with other cities, or if other cities have been interested in also doing this, the model that you have where you're doing the jobs to people who are
Yeah.
where they're getting jobs to construct homes and repurpose that wood and
So we're starting to connect with other cities. So we had the mayor of St. Louis and 10 of her staff fly in and spend the day with us to do this. In places in North Carolina, they're interested in this as well. It is expanding the view of the people who work in urban and community forestry to think about jobs as maybe the biggest reason to interact with trees in this way and to use these materials. But we are trying to transport this. Last December, the Forest Service ran for 4 different states and localities something called the Urban Wood Academy, which we did training in this. And it included people from the states of Oklahoma, Mississippi, Georgia, Virginia, Philadelphia, Sacramento, Boise, Idaho, and I think that's it. And we're going to be doing the academy again in September. Sure.
Question. How do you utilize other agencies to help you get this done? Meaning that, you've got your little niche. How do you then reach out to the city planners, to,
right,
social and people who are getting lots of money from places to then do what you're doing? Because as you mentioned, it's a hugely complex issue.
Yeah.
So
you got to solve you got to solve their problems. Luckily, I got the video. Like, I show them the video, and they're like, "Oh, this is great." And then you know, what you have to do is show how you're going to solve those problems for them. So housing and community development, we're going to get the buildings down. Department of Public Works wants to keep the stuff out of the landfill. You've got economic development who's like, it's worth a lot to have people who are employed and not drawing upon other resources. I think our big missing thing that we have yet to figure out is what is the health benefits of this? Because that is another huge source of funds. But we have to have that diagram, and you kind of have to assess your audience. Like, are they willing to tolerate that big diagram? Or do I need to, I wouldn't say dumb down, but do I need to selectively to do it? Also, it turns out that running field tours is incredibly compelling. But what they see is not only different agencies or disciplines coming together, but also different sectors. So you have Humanum, which is a nonprofit organization, job training. You have Room and Board showing up, flying in from Minneapolis whenever we ask to do this, and you have OpenWorks. And so they see that this is a business solution, ultimately, at the end of the day, as well as the avoided costs that are involved. And it allows Humanum to go to a foundation and say, can we have $1.5 million to fully capitalize a wood yard and be taking all the trees, and we will never come back because we will be financially solvent within 3 years, right? So it's also the business model that is helpful as well as addressing their problems. If you're always going to depend upon the government giving you money or foundations giving you money, you're just headed for oblivion. You know, so we have to figure out the solutions to this that take advantage of the private sector, or I wouldn't say take advantage of the private sector, that involve the private sector, right? You know, and everyone sees ways that they benefit, but they see ways that other people benefit. And I think a key thing that for why we've been successful, one of my bosses said, it's amazing what you can accomplish if you don't have to take credit for it. And so there's a level of humility that everyone has brought to this. Gordon.
Yeah, thank you, Morgan. That was really interesting to see the progress. A quick question that was, I think, came into my mind when you started talking about the general transition of Baltimore to being majority or almost totally black. What's the relationship of all this to the suburbs now, which is meaning it seems to me you have to go outside Baltimore City and start looking at what's happening in the related suburbs, redlining, the loan program, all of that, because that's what's now allowed all this to happen, arguably.
I don't have an answer for that. I think we just have to deal with what we have in front of us is complicated enough, and that requires sort of high levels of policy and interjurisdictional cooperation that they're struggling just to do with stormwater, which is a relatively simple problem compared to this. So I don't know how one would do that. But it's a good question.
Well, we've run out of time, and with that, I would like to thank Morgan one more time. I told everyone to use the microphone, then I didn't use it. Okay, and then also invite Colleen to describe our next exciting event.
So thank you all for coming, and next Monday we will be back in the same location with 3 city agency directors from New Haven talking about innovative management of urban infrastructure. That includes the director of parks, transportation, and engineering. So hope to see you all then. Thanks.